There is a kind of expectation we carry when we think about the past: neat timelines, tidy labels. Bronze Age, Iron Age, Neolithic, boxes on museum shelves where artifacts receive polite placards and measured distances from the nearest grid line. We like to believe that with enough carbon dates, stratigraphic layers, and peer-reviewed papers, history will sit still and explain itself. But the world keeps offering us moments that refuse those boxes. Imagine standing at the edge of a freshly exposed trench, the air cold and sharp, fog clinging to the fields like a secret. You expect bones, pottery sherds, maybe a hearth. Instead, you find stones aligned in a way that no one who maps the immediate environment can explain, an object shaped with tools no one has yet found in the same layer, or inscriptions whose script refuses every known alphabet. Those finds pull at the seams of our comfortable narrative and demand something harder than a label, an imagination capable of holding evidence and wonder at once. That tension, rigor versus awe, is the engine of this story. We'll walk through places where the dirt has given up clues that point in 5 different directions at once, and where the simplest question, "How did they do that?" branches into political intrigue, lost technology, myth, and sometimes the unpleasant possibility that some things might remain forever out of reach. I promise you revelations, dead ends, and theories so wild they will make you question what counts as normal for our shared human past. We will move from field notes and lab reports into the fog of legend and then back again, because these mysteries are stitched from both kinds of evidence, the physical and the remembered. As we go, keep in mind this is not a treasure hunt for sensational headlines. It is an invitation to look carefully, ask better questions, and to feel, for a moment, the embarrassing thrill of not knowing. We are comfortable with expertise, but it is precisely where expertise ends that real wonder begins. And so, step lightly. Picture yourself walking that foggy trail at dawn, headlamp swinging, reading the outlines of ruins like a new language. Hear the small, ordinary sounds, the scrape of brush, the far-off call of birds, and beneath them the older hum of curiosity, a promise that whatever the earth has kept, the truth will be stranger and more human than we expect. Our first stop is a place whose outlines look straightforward from the air but do not behave like any settlement we thought we understood. It sits on a windswept plain where trade routes intersected for thousands of years, yet the architecture here is stubbornly unlike its neighbors. Massive stone blocks fitted together with joints so tight a knife blade cannot pass between them, corners measured with geometrical precision, and an orientation that ignores the local river and instead aligns with a starry pattern only visible from certain times of year. What we find on the surface are monumental platforms, long terraces, and carved stones that bear symbols not seen elsewhere on the continent. Radiocarbon samples from associated organic material place occupation phases across a span of centuries, precise enough to say that the builders flourished during a time of widespread metal use, and puzzling enough to note the absence of local metalworking debris. Who were these builders? One line of thinking casts them as local elites who had access to a specialized knowledge of stoneworking and an ideology that mandated monumentality as social control. They gathered labor, imported ideas, and created an urban stage for power. Another theory suggests external influence, agents from distant coasts, sailing in with a technology that moved faster than the archaeologists' maps. Yet another, more controversial hypothesis proposes a deliberate ritual logic. The entire complex may have been less urban center and more ceremonial machine, designed to manipulate perception and cosmology. Still, for all the measurements and chisels and stratigraphic sections, a tracker following the lines of stone can't help but whisper about something older, a continuity of practice so refined it seems to anticipate tools that appear much later in the archaeological record. Picture a chill dawn, mist dragging itself across the lower plazas, and you walking slowly between the perpendicular planes of cut stone, fingers tracing grooves that have not seen a human hand in 1,000 years. Now, let's be fair, monumental architecture is hardly unique in human history. But here's where it gets tricky. The construction techniques do not match any known local tradition, and certain carved motifs repeat with a consistency that suggests a rulebook. If there was a handbook, if there was a master plan, where did it come from, And how did a seemingly isolated community produce work that rivals sites hundreds of kilometers away? We still don't know. Further inland, where a river bends like a question mark, there is an assemblage of artifacts that reads like a technological riddle. Among the expected pottery and bone tools, excavators found a compact mechanism housed in a corroded bronze casing, a gear train of surprising complexity, miniature in scale, inlaid with markings that appear both symbolic and numerical. In some ways it resembles timekeeping devices we attribute to much later eras, calendars, mechanical computations, astronomical predictors, and yet it was retrieved from a context dated centuries before the earliest secure evidence of similar mechanisms. Historians call such finds the anachronistic heart, because they force a rethinking of technological development as a straight line. One camp of scholars argues that the mechanism is simply the work of an ingenious local artisan who solved a particular problem, then died, and whose craft was lost to the vicissitudes of history. Another camp sees it as evidence of diffusion, itinerant craftsmen, trade networks, or conquered engineers bringing knowledge to the site. A more speculative voice suggests that there are holes in our record because the materials used for the earliest mechanisms corrode easily and rarely survive. Therefore, what looks anomalous to us might have been ordinary to contemporaries. Still, for all the lab reconstructions and gear ratio calculations, edges of the mechanism resist explanation. Tiny teeth cut with a finesse that implies tools we have not found, scales calibrated to celestial movements peculiar to regions hundreds of miles away. Picture yourself hunched over a wooden table in a nightside workshop, sunlight slipping through a shutter, an artisan peering through a lens fashioned from polished crystal. You can almost feel the warmth of the bronze as it sets. Now let your imagination balance against the lab. Could this object be an accidental convergence of curiosity and necessity, or a pointer to lost guilds of makers? We still don't know. Deep beneath layers of ash and silt, in a region where the language of stone seems to form a defiant dialect of its own, there are walls incised with images that complicate every tidy origin story. The images show what look like longboats, oarsmen with garments woven in patterns not seen in the adjacent settlements, and a range of fauna that suggests contact with distant ecosystems. Nearby, a collection of grave goods seems to betray an economy rooted in maritime exchange, exotic shells, pigments derived from far-off minerals, and beads whose chemical signatures point to coastlines hundreds of kilometers away. The stratigraphy tells us these were not one-off gifts. They accumulate over generations. What social system produces such sustained far-flung exchange? One interpretation reads this as evidence of early seafaring polities, communities that mastered navigation and sustained contact across open waters far earlier than textbooks claim. Another suggests that these goods moved across land-based intermediary networks, changing hands repeatedly and accumulating value along the way. A darker hypothesis invokes the role of merchant elites who orchestrated exchange as a form of political power, using exotic goods to bind distant chieftains into a web of dependence. Still, for all the mapping of currents and isotope analyses, the human experience remains opaque. How did these voyages feel? Imagine standing on a prow as gulls will overhead, the coastline receding into a smear of blue, the labor of 1,000 tiny decisions, rope, sail, wind, bringing a cargo into a harbor that has never seen you. The visual evidence insists on action, not static trade. It insists on skill, courage, and risk. But here's where it gets tricky. The wood remains we radiocarbon date are from seasons that do not align easily with the known sailing windows, suggesting possible night navigation or a calendar that did not follow the patterns we expect. Did they sail with instruments of lost sophistication? Or did they rely on oral navigational memories so precise they rival our charts? We still don't know. In a valley once ringed by dense forest, archaeologists uncovered a ring of monoliths so precisely arranged that modern surveyors used lasers to verify alignments down to the millimeter. From above, the arrangement makes a pattern that some interpret as a map of the night sky on a particular date several millennia ago. On the stones themselves are incised figures, some represent animals, others celestial bodies, and some appear to be stylized human forms elongated in ways that suggest mythic exaggeration. But it isn't just artistry that puzzles researchers. Buried beneath the stones, sealed in a pocket of sterile sediment, are human remains of unusual size. These skeletons show proportions outside typical human variation: longer limb bones, unusual cranial measurements, and dental patterns inconsistent with regional diets. The team ran genetic analyses that placed these individuals within the broader population's DNA cluster, yet their morphological differences raise a parade of questions. Were these differences the result of particular lifestyles, nutritional regimes, or pathologies? Or do they point to a separate group, perhaps migrant or isolated, with a distinct genetic trajectory? Several competing theories push toward social explanation, perhaps ritual modification, intentional cranial deformation, or selective burial of certain lineages created the unusual metrics. Another hypothesis reads ancient texts and local myths, stories of giants and long-haired hill people, as folkloric memories distorted from real, but now extinct, population subgroups. A more speculative strand proposes that the measurements might reveal interbreeding with a group adapted to different ecological pressures, producing a morphology that looks foreign to our expectations. Picture walking among the monoliths as dusk slides in, drums echoing through the night, the stones' shadows long and obedient. You imagine those buried there once strode the same soil, perhaps revered, perhaps feared. Now, let's be fair, skeletal variation is complex, and bone alone can mislead. Yet for all the isotope mixes and morphometric graphs, the footage of the site at twilight, the sense of scale and ritual choreography, insists on something more than data. We still don't know. Far from the valley, carved into a mountainside where weather scours any promise of preservation, lies a sequence of terraces so finely cut into bedrock that the seams between slabs are almost invisible. Some terraces bear channels that suggest hydraulic sophistication, sluices, settling basins, and distribution systems that would allow precision irrigation across uneven gradients. The sheer scale of labor required to hew rock and then engineer water flow implies a bureaucratic capacity and a social contract to maintain infrastructure over generations. Yet the ceramics deposited in construction layers belong to a culture previously thought to subsist through small-scale horticulture, lacking the centralized administration required for such engineering feats. Did this culture organize itself in an unexpectedly complex way? Or did they inherit this infrastructure from a preceding society and repurpose it? Archaeologists debate whether we are seeing the remains of a once hyper-cooperative polity or the skeleton of an imperial imposition that collapsed and left behind only architectural ghosts. One line of thought suggests cooperative villages bound by ritual obligations, shared labor motivated not by taxation but by worldview. Another points to evidence of stratification in grave goods, differences in richness that hint at hierarchy and the capacity to command labor. Yet a third, more radical view proposes that the terraces are not agricultural at all but part of a ritual landscape designed to mimic cosmological patterns, where water represents the movement of time or stars. Here is where it gets tricky. Chemical analysis of sediments shows signatures of crops that don't match the staples of the region. Pollen analysis hints at introduced species. So either these people practiced a forgotten kind of agriculture, or the terraces belong to a vanished experiment in landscape transformation whose purpose we misread. Picture yourself at dawn, the terraces lined in a geometry that refuses to be purely practical, mists pooling in the cut channels like slow rivers of light, and hear the faint whisper of an organizing principle that may have been economic, religious, or both. We still don't know. On a windswept island, where basalt cliffs meet a surf that has outlived many empires, stand figures carved from volcanic rock whose faces are both oddly individualized and maddeningly unreadable. Some statues are over 10 meters tall, their heads disproportionately large, their bodies buried to the neck as if each statue wears the land like a collar. The statues face inland, toward the settlements that once fed them offerings. But the most puzzling thing about these monoliths is what lies under them, a web of tunnels and platforms, echoing man-made caves that suggest not mere display but a complex of burials, storage, and ritual practice. The soil around the statues contains microbotanical assemblages showing diets rich in resources once thought impossible to sustain on the island alone. Was this island world a hub in a broader marine economy, importing nutrients, ideas, and people? Some researchers raise the idea of competitive monument building, chiefs or lineages building boulder statuary to claim status, while others suggest a cosmological purpose, where statues scale and orientation encode genealogies and myths. The tunnels below offer a material counterpoint: domestic debris, craft waste, and high-status goods all commingled, complicating any single narrative. Picture walking inside one of those tunnels, torchlight flickering over a wall painted in red ochre, the breath of centuries on the air, and imagine a community that invested so much in stone because it needed memory to survive. Now let's be fair, monumental statuary is an expression of identity as much as power. But here's where it gets tricky. The statues show tool marks made by techniques we have not reconstructed at the scale required, and the buried gardens around the platforms display soil chemistry that hints at inputs from outside systems. Could this island have been less isolated than we assume, an intentional node in a maritime lattice? Or did ingenious adaptation allow a relatively small community to punch above its ecological weight? We still don't know. One must be careful pressing further into the weeds of myth and speculation, because facts matter: radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic contexts, micro-artifact distributions. These are the bedrock on which any claim must stand. But facts do not preclude wonder. I want you now to imagine a late-night lab, fluorescent light humming, a technician pinning tiny beads of residue from an artifact under a microscope. The result is a chromatogram that shows an unexpected pigment source from a desert hundreds of miles away, a mineral that would have required a network of exchange or a journey of immense risk. Or imagine a field note, a farmer pointing to a mound in his field and saying, "We always emptied this when the rains come. It's been like that since my father." And archaeologists realizing they are looking at a structure no one else has recorded because it sits in an overlooked corner of a map. The cumulative effect of such moments is a geography that looks less like a finished map and more like a palimpsest. Script layered upon script, each hand reusing, correcting, and sometimes erasing the last. Declaring an archaeological mystery solved often requires a humility that the public discourse eschews because solving sells better than ambiguity. Here's a truth I will carry through every segment: complexity often explains what looks like contradiction. Yet sometimes complexity points us toward the truly strange, the exceptional artifact whose features sit outside the expected envelope. Those exceptions teach us two things at once: about the ingenuity of past humans, and about the limits of our assumptions. And that is the emotional center of every site we will visit, not merely, "How did they do this?" but, "How did these people want to be remembered?" That is a question that reverberates with the same force whether carved on stone, encoded in metal, or whispered in a myth that persists for millennia. Let us pause briefly to acknowledge how human these puzzles are. Each frustrating dataset is a person who once brushed flour from their hands, who once negotiated marriages, quarrels, and alliances. When we stand before a mysterious artifact, we should not first ask, "Can this be weaponized into a theory?" but rather, "What did it mean to the people who made it?" This empathetic angle does not dilute scientific rigor, it enriches it. The myths that wrap around many of these finds, lost tribes, cursed stones, giants in the deep, are not just sensational hooks for a late-night show. They are cultural memory, compressed into metaphor. They often preserve kernels of truth, migrations, catastrophes, social upheavals, encoded into images and transmitted across generations. Our job as listeners, narrators, and investigators is to translate those metaphors into evidentiary hypotheses, to weigh them against the dirt and the data, and to accept that sometimes the dirt will not yield. To close this opening passage, picture once more the fog-clad plain, the mechanism with its tiny teeth, the monolith valley at dusk, the terraces glinting with still water, and the island whose stone faces watch the sea. Hear the quiet human pulse beneath all of them, hands shaping, mouths telling, drums marking time. These mysteries matter because they remind us that the past is not a museum, it is a conversation. Keep listening, because the next chapters will take us deeper into those conversations, and into the places where answers, when they arrive, often beget even bigger questions. Beneath a tangle of scrub and the lazy ribbon of a road, There is a subterranean town that reads like an argument between necessity and invention. You arrive at the surface in late afternoon, heat ringing off the rocks, and the entrance is almost disappointingly ordinary: a collapsed stone lintel, a trodden path curving into shadow. But as soon as you duck below the lip, the air cools and the world rearranges itself. Passageways branch like the veins of a leaf, rooms open into vaulted halls, and in one chamber a bank of polished metal discs sits aligned on a plinth as if they were the remains of some mechanical observatory. The surfaces are pockmarked with incidental deposits that, on first glance, resemble the debris of long use, yet microscopic analysis reveals layers of abrasions, fine enough to suggest deliberate polishing with a paste of unknown composition. Nearby, fragments of glass that should have been rare for this era show signs of complex manufacture, lenses with focal curvature precise enough to suggest deliberate optical use. Now, let's be fair, caves and subterranean spaces get reused in every imaginable way: sanctuaries, storerooms, workshops. But here's where it gets tricky. The artifact assemblage includes small, standardized metal fittings, a sequence of stamped motifs that repeat with mathematical regularity, and traces of high-temperature operations in places that would have been difficult to ventilate. One theory proposes that this was not merely shelter but an industrial enclave, a closed workshop where metalworkers, glassmakers, or instrument makers practiced crafts that required secrecy, controlled environments, and perhaps guild-like transmission of skills. Another hypothesis frames the space as a refuge, a community retreating below ground during a period of instability and intensifying craft production out of sheer necessity to trade for food. A more speculative voice suggests an intentional fusion of ritual and technology, that the subterranean setting conferred a sacred seal on certain operations, and the objects produced there were as much talismans as tools. Still, for all the metallographic cross-sections and the careful experimental replications, some details refuse domestication. The lenses, when reconstructed, show aberration corrections that anticipate optical understanding credited to later centuries. The stamped motifs employ repeating units that encode ratios used in astronomical tables found elsewhere, yet no direct textual evidence links these craftspeople to the scribes who kept calendars. Picture yourself crouched in that cool hallway, lamplight flickering against glass, the smell of metal and old smoke, and imagine hands that learned to shape clarity out of molten sand long before anyone expected such knowledge. Could this subterranean network be evidence of parallel technical traditions, discrete, hidden schools of making that left few traces because their products were expensive, portable, and easily dispersed? Or are we remembering a lost crisis in which communities buried knowledge for safekeeping and later generations forgot the context entirely? We still don't know. Shift now to a wind-scraped desert plain where the ground is pocked by low mounds, and where, beneath layers of wind-blown sand, there were once archives. The discoveries here began as routine survey work. A plowline turned up a slab with incised marks. A shepherd found a cache of small tablets wrapped in textile fragments. When conservators unfolded the textiles and flattened the tablets, a script emerged, not quite an alphabet, not quite logographic, but something that behaves like both, compact signs combined into clusters that repeat with a grammar scholars struggle to model. Radiocarbon from the textiles and from organic residues in the tablet pits situates these documents in a period we thought to be largely pre-literate for the region. The tablets record lists, what may be inventories, and several extended sequences that correlate with lunar cycles and commodity tallies. One reading suggests an administrative economy, a bureaucracy cataloging movement of grain, livestock, and labor. Another proposes a ritual calendar in which enumerations correspond to offerings and pilgrimages, a liturgy encoded as accounting. Yet another interpretation wonders whether these tablets are not records at all but mnemonic devices, an ideographic script used by trained memory specialists to recall epic narratives, genealogies, and navigational lore. As always, context complicates these tidy readings. The sedimentary layers show abrupt changes, pollen spikes indicating irrigated fields cropping up in the horizon at the same time as the tablets, faunal remains indicating a switch to herd management consistent with transhuman movements, and a shift in ceramic styles that signals contact with a distant culture. There is even a hunk of worked meteorite embedded in one of the cache pits, its composition inconsistent with local geology, which would have been a rare and highly valued object. Now, let's be fair, writing systems and economic record-keeping often grow out of the same soil. They can be accounting and myths simultaneously. But here's where it gets tricky. Some clusters of signs on the tablets map neatly onto star charts visible from latitudes far to the north, suggesting either that astronomers traveled great distances to teach notation, or that the society recorded observations of celestial mechanics using a borrowed system. Picture yourself wiping sand from the edge of a brittle tablet in the heat of morning, tracing a repeated sign that looks like a tied knot, and thinking about the person whose daily work involved turning the world of obligation into marks on clay. How did such a script arise here, on the edge of a desert, and why did it apparently vanish? Was there a cataclysmic disruption that ended literacy, or did the script become the secret domain of a caste whose decline erased their hand? We still don't know. There is a ruin on a coastal shelf where trees once stood, a place that now tastes of salt and gull cry, which complicates every tidy notion of settlement continuity. The buildings are low, almost bunker-like, and the interiors contain flooring of compacted clay inlaid with tiny pebbles arranged in concentric spirals. Small hearths cluster at regular intervals, and within them were found residues of plants and resins that chemical analysis traces to distant shorelines and river deltas. Among the domestic detritus were game pieces carved from ivory and bone, some showing wear in ways that suggest long, ritualized play rather than casual leisure. Nearby, a narrow channel descends to a hidden cove where a series of posts and weirs indicate forced fish corralling, a sophisticated technique for catching and preserving fish. The combination of elaborate domestic leisure and refined aquatic engineering has led to several competing pictures. One frames the site as a node of elite leisure, a coastal retreat where the powerful rehearse their mythic identity through staged hunts and ceremonial games, while a servant class maintained the necessary infrastructure. Another sees it as an integrated mixed economy where ritual, subsistence, and craft were inextricable. The game pieces might have been instruction sets for captaincy and fishing operations, or mnemonic devices for transmission of rights and obligations. A third hypothesis argues that the architecture signals a planned community oriented around seasonal resource flows and that the material culture represents a specialized adaptation to marginal coastal niches. Yet, for all the careful microbotanical studies and taphonomic analysis, the emotional texture remains elusive. What did it feel like to spend winters in these low rooms, the sound of surf turning into a steady percussion, while the community gathered for feasts and navigational instruction? Picture a night where lanterns put strips of gold across the clay spirals, men and women speaking in measured cadences, and a young person learning the handling of nets and the rules of the game that would later determine leadership. Did the site flourish as a deliberate ecological specialization, or did it serve as a refuge, a cultural island built atop the collapse of inland systems? We still don't know. There is an archaeological site that has, more than once, crossed the border between material science and myth. On a ridge that watches a river plain, a complex of low platforms and narrow avenues was excavated, and within the precincts were unearthed figurative stones with faces rendered in an intense realism rarely seen in regional sculpture. The faces are portraiture of a kind, individual traits, expressions, and even what look like life stage markers, wrinkles, scars, the tilt of a mouth. But the stonework is not the only surprise. In the deepest deposit layers, the archaeologists found a cache of organic paints, binding agents, and a palette containing residues of pigments that modern chemists can trace to botanical and mineral sources from continents apart. The implication is not merely long-distance trade but an aesthetic language that intentionally sought out novelty and syncretism. How did this community obtain such a palette? One theory credits long-distance mercantile corridors that link distant elites through exchange of luxury goods and ideas. A more evocative hypothesis imagines itinerant artists and craftsmen carrying techniques across empires, creating cosmopolitan hubs in what were formerly thought to be backwater towns. Yet another voice reads the portrait stones as a nascent form of individualism, an ideology where personal identity was carved into the public landscape as a claim to legacy and memory. The tension intensifies when the funerary contexts associated with the portrait stones contain grave assemblages that include infant burials interred with objects typical for adult status, and skeletons showing evidence of healed injuries consistent with long lives of physical labor. Now, let's be fair, social complexity often manifests in the crevices between public display and private sacrifice. But here's where it gets tricky. Some of the pigments show isotopic anomalies best explained by trade with areas beyond known networks. Some of the portraiture models' faces with features not dominant in the local gene pool. If that is accurate, the stones are not simply local self-portraiture but a deliberate inclusion of the other, a public celebration of migration, adoption, and hybrid identity. Picture yourself stepping into the precinct at dawn, dust motes hanging like golden spores, and seeing a row of carved faces looking back at you, each one a testimony to a life that mattered. What does it mean that a town would invest so much in remembering individuals? Is this the effect of a social order eager to legitimize new elites, or an emergent ethic that elevated personal memory above lineage? We still don't know. There are landscapes where water itself becomes the mystery, not because irrigation failed, but because channels appear where water could not naturally have reached. In one such highland basin, a network of canals and reservoirs crosses impermeable bedrock, their inner surfaces sealed with a waterproofing so sophisticated that when modern engineers tested the technique, they could not exactly reproduce the longevity observed in the field. The system captures seasonal runoff, distributes it through a sequence of graded channels, and then deposits it into terraced plains that shimmer green in archaeological pollen profiles despite the aridity of the surrounding region. What has been extraordinary about this site is not only the engineering but the social mechanisms required to maintain it over centuries. Sluices must be cleaned, channels repaired, rituals performed to ensure cooperation across diverse micro-communities. One school of thought reads this as evidence of protostate formation, the ability to mobilize labor, extract surplus, and enforce schedules. Another perspective emphasizes ritual reciprocity, that water management was embedded in a cosmology where maintenance was an act of worship, and social cohesion emerged from shared obligations to spirits and ancestors. A third, more revisionist account suggests that the hydraulic works were seasonal, built and maintained in pulsed investments when environmental conditions permitted, then intentionally abandoned and reactivated across cycles of climate fluctuation. But here's where it gets tricky. Soil chemistry shows layers of alluvial deposition inconsistent with the project's supposed start date. Pollen suggests introduced crops that would have required new cultivation methods. And there are inscriptions carved into the headworks that resist translation, their syntax neither straightforwardly administrative nor purely ritual. Picture standing on a dam as a wind pulls at your clothing and the basin before you glitters with small lakes, and imagine the conversations, contracts, marriages, feasts, that must have taken place to keep these works alive. Was this a centralized polity with coercive power, or a network of cooperative communities who bound themselves to water because their lives depended on it? Perhaps it was both, or perhaps it was something else that blends governance, religion, and ecology into a single practice. We still don't know. Throughout these segments runs an often overlooked thread, the environmental fingerprints left behind by people who made choices under pressure. At many of these sites, pollen cores, isotopic ratios, and faunal assemblages tell a story that runs parallel to the architectural and material evidence. In some cases, the environment seems to have offered opportunities, river courses to exploit, unique mineral deposits to trade. In others, it seems to have imposed constraints that demanded ingenious adaptation. The tension between opportunity and constraint is where human creativity often blooms. Where water is scarce, people farm innovatively. Where trade routes cross, cosmopolitanism emerges. Yet environment also imposes rupture. Sudden climate shifts, droughts, or episodes of erosion can break the social contract, disperse knowledge, and leave behind the enigmatic artifacts that spark our mysteries. That is why, when we stare at an isolated artifact of advanced craft or at a monument whose construction techniques do not match anything else in the region, we must consider not only diffusion and innovation but also the possibility of cultural contact forced by environmental necessity. Picture a caravan threading a narrow corridor, beasts of burden heaving under loads of pigment and tool, negotiators trading in a market where language is less important than hands that can shape metal. When we stitch together the ecological data with the artifacts, a humanized picture emerges, one where choices about craft, ritual, and memory are responses to both the generous and the punishing face of nature. Still, for all this integrative analysis, holes remain. Some technologies appear suddenly, flourish, and vanish. Scripts appear in one valley and nowhere else. Monumental investments outlast the communities that built them, like ruins that keep the memory of a government long dead. Those absences are the engine of our curiosity. We ask not just, how, but, why did they stop? And sometimes the answer is simple collapse. Sometimes the answer is social transformation. Sometimes it remains maddeningly opaque. Picture, then, the slow work of archaeologists and indigenous communities together, brushing away the sand of centuries until a pattern emerges, then pausing, because every time a pattern becomes visible, it also raises new questions about the choices people made in the face of environmental change. We still don't know. We must remind ourselves that the categories we use, technology, ritual, elite, commoner, are modern analytic tools, not necessarily the mental scaffolding of the people we study. That makes interpretation treacherous but also exhilarating. When you stand at these sites, you are not simply reading objects, you are listening to echoes of thought forms that are alien and familiar at once. A copper disc polished like a mirror, a tablet cramped with signs that might be accounting or might be prayer, a statue whose face seems to watch you across centuries. What do these echoes tell us? They tell us that people, our people, experimented, learned, taught, migrated, and forgot. They tell us that mastery of a craft does not guarantee continuity, that centralized power can spring up and disappear, that written systems can be lost when the need to write fades, that monuments can stand as memorials of things we no longer remember how to fulfill. Therefore, our work is not merely excavation but translation, empathy, and sometimes humility. In every one of these places, the best conclusion we can muster at first is provisional, a working hypothesis that must stand up to new samples, new isotopic signatures, new cross-cultural comparisons. And yet, even in that provisionality, there is a moral. These artifacts are not curiosities for the elite consumption of connoisseurs. They are calls to our shared responsibility to the past. To preserve, to study, to allow unexpected discoveries to complicate our canonical histories. I want to close this section with an image you can carry. Imagine a long table under a corrugated roof at dusk, maps spread out, labeled paper cups, voices low and eager, and the relics of a day's dig laid out like a constellation across the tabletop. Someone teases out a bright thread of copper from a corroded fragment. Another person points to a sign cluster on a tablet. The youngest member of the field crew holds up a bead and laughs at how indestructible it seems under their thumb. In that small constellation are the human actors who make meaning, the laborers, the local elders who remember where the stones were always kept, the curator who argues for careful conservation, the graduate student who sees a pattern no one else has noticed. Archaeology is, at its best, a collective art of attention, and these mysteries persist because human attention is always partial. As you walk away from the table into night, the sky vast above, think about the work we do when we excavate not only objects but stories. Each discovery invites us to rewrite a line, to reframe a trade route, to imagine a different horizon. It asks us to keep our skepticism and our wonder in a delicate balance. And above all, it invites you, whether you are a scientist, a storyteller, or a curious viewer, to keep the habit of asking better questions, not, what did they lack? But, what did they do that we might yet learn from? We still don't know. Beneath the glass blue surface of a shallow bay lies a submerged city that looks, from sonar, like the blueprint of a dream, rectilinear streets, a harbor with carefully graded quays, and quayside structures arranged with a precision that suggests planning on a civic scale. The divers who first mapped it kept saying the same thing. It feels uncanny, as if someone paused a bustling port, sank it into water, and left the laundry on the ropes. What is most striking are the metal artifacts scattered in situ, sheets of a copper alloy hammered to exquisite thinness, fastenings drilled and threaded to a finesse that implies sophisticated hand tools, and a series of bronze plates etched with diagrams of sails and hulls that look as much like engineering manuals as they do art. Radiocarbon from the wooden piles gives us a tight window for construction, a few centuries before the historical records mention heavy maritime metallurgy in the region. One interpretation argues for catastrophic inundation, a city drowned by a sudden rise in sea level or a seismic event, its technological horizon frozen. Another, more provocative theory posits a maritime culture whose metallurgical specialization was a localized adaptation to an economy of ship maintenance and navigation, a professional guild of shipwrights whose craft left behind technical manuals and metal rather than clay. Yet a third voice suggests the plates were didactic, teaching aids for apprentices, codifying a body of knowledge that could be carried across waters more reliably than volatile manuscripts. Picture yourself descending through green-blue light, bubbles streaming like brief stars, feeling the weight of salt on your skin as you brush a bronze plate with a gloved hand. The etchings feel like fingerprints from someone who once taught a roomful of young apprentices how to read wind. Still, for all the mapping and metallurgical essays, we cannot yet say whether this submerged city represents a local peak of craft, an outpost of a trans-regional industry, or a one-off technological flowering snuffed out by catastrophe. We still don't know. High on a windswept ridge, a ring of earthworks unfolds like an enormous clock face carved into the landscape. The embankments, when mapped with LiDAR, resolve into a sequence of concentric enclosures connected by causeways and punctuated by rectangular platforms whose orientations lock to solar events on particular days. Within the rings, excavations revealed compact zones of intensive craft, glassmaking, bead production, and metallurgy, all compressed into surprisingly small workshops. The concentration of high-skill manufacture alongside a ritualized landscape has led to at least 3 stories. One reads the earthworks as the ceremonial center of a seasonal fair, a place where exchange, ritual, and craft converged during predictable gatherings. Traders would come, workshops would set up temporary kills, and elites would stage performances that reaffirmed alliances. Another view reads the site as a permanent technocratic hub, a state-sponsored complex where specialist artisans were concentrated to control production of prestige goods and their distribution. A third, more interpretive hypothesis proposes that the earthworks were a performative landscape, designed to be traversed in a ritual sequence that encoded social learning, where the act of making was itself a sacred practice. What complicates every tidy account are the human remains inserted in shallow pits at regular intervals, some buried with tools, others with ritual paraphernalia that resembles both makers' kits and offerings. Is the maker honored in death, or bound by vow, or sacrificed as part of a covenant with the gods of craft? Picture walking a causeway as wind knives through the grasses, the shadow of an embanked bank passing like a slow hand over the land, and imagine the hum of furnaces at dusk, voices raised in instruction and argument. For all the sophisticated landscape archaeology and burial analyses, we are uncertain whether technological concentration created the ritual or ritual created the technology. We still don't know. Carved into a cavern of stalactites are paintings whose pigments refuse to belong to the local geology. Ultramarine hues derived from minerals that should lie far beyond the known trade corridors, and binders that include compounds chemically associated with coastal algae. The images themselves are unusual, blending naturalistic depictions of fauna with schematic diagrams that could be maps, star charts, or even plumbing plans. When conservators took microsamples, they found layers, the same motif repainted over generations, sometimes inverted as if to correct or appropriate an earlier narrative. Ancient DNA from residue scraped from the floor shows a complex stew of human lineages exposed to maritime and inland genetic inputs, suggesting the cavern was a meeting place for diverse peoples. One reading interprets the site as an intercultural shrine, a neutral ground where groups met to exchange knowledge, reaffirm kinship, and negotiate trade. Another posits that the paintings encode technical knowledge, mnemonic diagrams for navigation, seasonal hunting strategies, or even agricultural cycles, designed to be preserved across generations in a place where humidity and darkness stabilized pigments. A more mythic interpretation hears echoes of sky books and earth weavings. In the schematic lines, treating the panels as cosmological maps where social order is made visible. Imagine crouching below the drip line, your breath tiny in the heavy air, tracing a painted line that could be either a river or a constellation, and feeling the uncanny intimacy of a place meant for secrets and oaths. Yet, pigment chemistry and DNA cannot tell us unequivocally whether these images were practical diagrams, cosmological texts, or a hybrid that served many purposes at once. We still don't know. On an upland table where the wind carries the sharp smell of juniper, archaeologists discovered a set of stone seats carved into a semicircle with a central platform whose floor is inlaid with an unusual star-shaped mosaic. Embedded beneath the mosaic were metal objects, small plates scored with lines that when aligned produce a sequence resembling a mechanical code. The seats are positioned so that, on a certain day of the year, a shaft of light falls across the platform and aligns with the metallic plates. Ethnographers working with local oral traditions recorded a fragmentary chant referencing the time when the stone breathes the sun, but its meaning is obscure. One interpretation frames the site as a civic calendar, a public observatory and civic clock where communal decisions were synchronized to celestial cues. Another theory suggests a performative function, that the platform was used for public oaths, judicial performance, or initiation, the alignment of light and metal providing a ritual authentication. A more technical hypothesis entertains the plates as part of an analog computational device used to predict seasonal events critical for pastoral mobility. Picture yourself sitting on one of those carved seats as the light crosses the mosaic, hearing the murmur of a gathered crowd, feeling that precise, electrical moment when consensus and cosmos intersect. Despite photometric modeling and archaeological context, however, the precise social choreography remains elusive. Who sat on those seats, who read the metal, and what obligations were enacted by the alignment? We still don't know. In a landscape otherwise dominated by small settlements, there appears suddenly a monumental causeway, strewn with carved milestones and terminating at a complex of enclosures that could be administrative or ceremonial. The pavement stones are fitted in an architectural language that seems to borrow motifs from distant cultural repertoires, and the route connects a highland plateau to a lowland valley rich in particular minerals. Analyses of residue on the pavement show traces of plant oils and compounds linked to ritual fumigation, indicating the causeway was more than a trade route, it was a processional road. One interpretation stresses economic reasons. This was a managed corridor for moving concentrated valuable resources to a central polity that could process and redistribute them. Another emphasizes symbolic function, a staged landscape where political power was made visible, where procession and spectacle translated resource control into legitimizing performance. A speculative voice sees it as a linked system of sanctuaries, itinerant shrines moving along the pavement with the seasons, carrying relics and authority. Picture a caravan slipping along the causeway at dawn, banners whipping, children running beside oxen, while at each milestone priests went through ritual exchanges to bind the road into social life. For all the stable isotope work and contextual readings, we still cannot be sure whether the road's primary function was economic, symbolic, or a hybrid intentionally designed to fuse both. We still don't know. There are artifacts whose physical presence alone creates an anxiety. A small, perfectly spherical object made of a copper tin alloy whose surface is incised with a script so tiny it required a magnifying lens to read during analysis. The incisions form spiraling patterns that a team of epigraphers tentatively linked to a calendrical formula, but the scale and precision demand tools and optical aids not yet recovered in the same deposits. When placed on a turntable and spun, the sphere produces a faint, harmonic ring that decreases in frequency as it slows, a property that led some to call it a singing globe. The object was found sealed inside a ceramic vessel alongside compact discs of beaten metal that, when stacked in a certain order, produced resonant harmonics. One hypothesis sees these as liturgical devices used in ritual soundscapes, instruments that structured performance and memory. Another reads them as mnemonic toys or teaching aids designed to demonstrate mathematical properties or celestial cycles in a tactile manner. A more experimental theory treats them as technological experiments, acoustic research pursued by artisan scientists curious about material vibrations and their applications. Imagine holding the sphere in your palm and feeling a subtle pulse as it rings, the sensation of auditory memory made object. Despite acoustic modeling and experimental archaeology, the social context, who owned such an object, how widely such knowledge was shared, and whether these were tools of a priestly class or the curious few, remains an open question. We still don't know. Each of these vignettes, when stitched together, begins to look less like a collection of exotic curiosities and more like a chorus singing the same themes in different keys: intense specialization, unexpected mobility, ritualization of technical knowledge, and the ever-present blending of practical needs with cosmological imagination. Across all these sites, artifacts frequently sit at the intersection of utility and meaning. A craft object is not merely efficient, it is a story, a claim to identity, and sometimes a trapdoor into the past that collapses if wrongly interpreted. We must maintain a modest confidence when reconstructing past lives, confident enough to use our tools rigorously, modest enough to accept that our categories may be wrong. For you, the listener, that is the hum of this work, the constant oscillation between what we can measure and what we must imagine. As we continue, think of the past not as a set of problems to be solved once and for all, but as an ongoing conversation. People built with intention, they wrote, sang, and argued, and their choices have left us artifacts that push our questions forward rather than delivering final answers. The thrill lies precisely in this indeterminacy, that a polished sphere may ring, a submerged harbor may hold a manual, a causeway may be both road and right. Keep walking, because the next moments will take us to even deeper puzzles, to artifacts that ask us to reconsider not only their maker's capabilities but our own categories of possibility. There is a hill out of which, when rains come, 1,000 tiny ledgers wash like secrets into the gullies, slabs of wood and wax, fragments of parchment, and the occasional copper tag stamped with numerical tallies. Archaeologists first thought these were the detritus of ordinary bookkeeping, grain rations, tax lists, and household inventories, until a conservationist, working in a laboratory lit like an operating theater, began to see patterns in the palimpsest. Under one layer of scraped wax, a star map unfurled. Beneath another, a set of numerical coefficients that, when plotted, matched the periodicities of a comet track visible from that latitude every few centuries. The stratigraphy suggests accumulation across many hands, scribes copying, erasing, annotating, which turns a trivial ledger into a living archive. One interpretation is practical and dully elegant. These were the ledgers of a coastal polity that tracked celestial phenomena to regulate planting, navigation, and ritual calendars. Their accuracy came from long-term observation rather than sudden genius. Another interpretation imagines a scholarly class, perhaps itinerant astronomer priests, whose craft merged calculation with prophecy, turning accounts into cosmic liturgy. Yet another, more skeptical voice warns against overreading. Numerical patterns can appear by chance when you have many numbers, and the human mind loves to turn noise into pattern. Still, the material evidence insists on sustained attention. The ink recipes, the ruling marks, the layered corrections, and these point to a culture that kept its knowledge physically near but conceptually high, knowledge placed at the intersection of economy and sky. Picture yourself in the lab, the smell of warmed beeswax, the conservator's gloved fingers lifting a sliver to reveal a string of stars, and imagine unrolling that same sequence under a night sky where coastal lights are only the first compass. Now, let's be fair, recovery bias matters. Organic records rarely survive, and survival here might be the relic of circumstance rather than typical practice. But for all the statistical cautions and radiocarbon confidence intervals, the emotional truth is simple and thrilling. A people who measured their lives by both harvest and heavens. We still don't know. Not far from there, carved into a basalt ridge that faces a valley of shifting winds, is a tunnel system whose entrance is small and unassuming but whose interior opens onto chambers that belie an architectural imagination trained on air itself. The caves are not natural. They were hewn with intent and then lined with a coating that, when sampled, shows a microstructure optimized for thermal buffering and sound reflection. Early explorers found corridors with cross-ventilation shafts so ingeniously placed that the airflow seems to follow a predictable pattern, cooling some chambers while deliberately trapping warmth in others. Some rooms contain arrays of stone benches arranged in acoustic arcs. Others house niches with ceramic resonators. One archaeologist, half joking and half serious, suggested calling the site a thermal acoustic workshop, because it appears to combine climate control with sound design. How do you explain such early engineering? One thesis argues convergence. Humans everywhere seek comfort, and given time and social coordination, ingenious solutions emerge independently. A second thesis proposes specialized knowledge, a cadre of engineers and ritual technicians who traveled, teaching venting techniques in exchange for patronage. A third pushes toward ritual function, that control of air and sound was theological, a way to simulate God's voices, to make breath seem miraculous. Picture yourself entering a cool chamber, feeling the hair on your arms lift as a draft crosses the stone and a bowl struck at the center sends a pure tone that seems to hang in the air long after the strike. Imagine the social ritual, initiates seated along benches, elders narrating a lineage while the cave seems to affirm their words. Yet, for all the structural modeling and experimental recreations, the social scaffolding does not firm up. Who funded such labor-intensive projects, and why choose subterranean practices over surface architecture? We still don't know. There is a delta site where the bones of fish and the remains of shorebirds alternate in layered bands with fragments of finely worked stone and tiny decorated glass beads. The beads themselves confound the easy narrative. Their chemical signatures trace back to mineral sources not within sailing distance, and their manufacturing style is unlike anything catalogued in the nearby coastal workshops. In addition, the stratigraphic sequence shows bursts of intense deposition separated by long periods of quiescence, suggesting episodic occupation, perhaps linked to environmental cycles or trade winds. One line of explanation emphasizes the place as a seasonal nexus, a rendezvous point for specialized fishers and traded cargo brokers who came only when currents and markets aligned. Another reads the beads as markers of identity, tokens exchanged in matrimonial or political ceremonies that tied mobile groups together across long distances. A competing hypothesis suggests that these beads circulated as prestige goods in a system where their scarcity amplified value, and that elite demand drove long-distance procurement networks. Now, for all the geochemical signatures and microfaunal analyses, the human rhythms are the hardest to recover. Did the delta hum with seasonal markets, tents and drying racks flapping in wind? Or was it a sacred shore where pilgrims left offerings to the sea and returned home with new ritual objects? Picture a morning when the tide reveals an abandoned net, and children wade into knee-deep water collecting beads that catch like bright stones. Imagine elders telling stories about travelers who arrive with foreign songs and teach new ways to treat fish for storage. But here's where it gets tricky. Climatic records show abrupt shifts at times that coincide with occupational hiatuses, meaning environmental stress could restructure social networks just as decisively as political rivalry. We still don't know. On a rocky promontory where cliffs plunge into a churning ocean, there stands a ring of small stone platforms, each with a depressed hearth and a carved stone lid that fits like a cap. The platforms cluster such that, when occupied, the sound of one hearth carries to the next, creating a near-continuous whisper of communication across the promontory. Excavations revealed a pattern of repeated rebuilding, like a palimpsest of domestic acts. Under the hearths, compaction layers showed alternating pulses of intense burning and long quiescence. What makes this place remarkable is not only its layout but the ritual paraphernalia found in sealed contexts. Votive tokens carved in bone, small mirrors of polished lapis, and a sequence of figurines whose iconography blends human and marine forms. Anthropologists propose that this was a maritime shrine where fishing rites and ancestor cults merged. Ethnographers note parallel practices among later coastal peoples who performed offerings before long journeys. A contrasting framework interprets the sites as way stations in a larger navigational system, nodes where crews paused, exchanged news, and signed ritual covenants before crossing a hazardous strait. A third perspective reads the figurines and votives as mnemonic devices, maps of route knowledge encoded in symbolic form for transmission to apprentices. Picture standing at dusk on a platform, the wind straight from the sea, tiny flames lipping the horizon, heart rates sinking to the distant call of breakers, and imagine men and women shaping small offerings while telling apprentices which current to avoid and which star to follow. But here's the hard fact: ritual and navigation are hard to separate in maritime communities. Rites are tools for safety, and technical knowledge is entangled with myth. For all the radiocarbon dates and protein residue analyses, the daily choreography, who lit which hearth, who held what responsibility, remains a human story we can sketch but not fully inhabit. We still don't know. There exists, tucked into a mountain pass that was once a crossroads of shepherds and merchants, a field of battered stones that, when pieced together, form an instrument of surprising subtlety, a long, graduated ramp carved with a repeating series of notches, each notch set at a precise angle. When experimental archaeologists built a replica and ran water across it, the ramp worked as a flow regulator of startling efficiency. By diverting minute amounts, it could meter water to different terraces according to need. What elevates this site from clever to confounding is a set of small grooves along the ramp's edge that appear calibrated to frequencies. When someone runs a reed across them, a low drone resonates that slightly accelerates the water's flow. Was this an early example of biomechanical engineering that combined acoustics and hydraulics to fine-tune irrigation? One explanation regards the grooves as accidental, their acoustic properties incidental to their practical role. Another reads them as intentional, an artisanal innovation where embodied knowledge, the sound and feel of flow, was codified into the stone. A third hypothesis pushes the envelope further, suggesting that the site was part of a sensorial pedagogy where apprentices learned water management through song and touch, training a communal memory for delicate tasks. Picture yourself kneeling by the ramp, fingers wet, running a reed and feeling the subtle feedback loop between sound and stream, hearing elders who sing the schedule of watering, and seeing the geometry of care etched into stone. Still, for all the experimental replications and ethnographic parallels, the leap from observation to social practice requires caution. We must not collapse plausible imagination into assertion. We still don't know. If these scenes sometimes tempt us toward romanticization, the artisan priest, the singing ramp, the submerged manual, our work requires that we hold two things at once: an appetite for story and a devotion to evidence. The former fuels curiosity, the latter keeps us honest. When we imagine a community gathered under a cave's cool shadow to make sound and law, or a delta bustling like a seasonal market, we are not writing fantasy. We are extrapolating from human patterns that repeat across time and place. Yet we also know that human lives are idiosyncratic, full of accidents, improvisations, and forgotten innovations. That is why these mysteries matter. They remind us that mastery is fragile and that loss is not merely about things but about practices, languages, and embodied skills that can vanish when a corridor closes or when a dynasty falls out of favor. So as you listen to these stories, and picture the manuscripts under wax, the tuned grooves along a ramp, the hearths on a promontory, carry this balanced skepticism. Be generous in imagination, rigorous in method. The past is generous in its oddities. It rewards those willing to be unsettled. And whenever the data grow thin, our respect for the people who once tended those fires, carved those ramps, wrote in wax, must grow proportionally. We still don't know. When we step back from the trenches, the labs, the sonar maps and the microscopes, a pattern starts to hum beneath our fingers. These discoveries are not isolated curiosities but variations on a theme. They speak of people who confronted limits, of materials, of climate, of social order, and answered with combinations of imagination and stubborn practice that sometimes leave traces we can read and sometimes leave only questions that press like a stone in the mouth. Across sun-bleached plains and misted valleys, on cliffs where surf rehearses itself every hour, and in cellars where lenses and bronze discs waited like patient thoughts, the human impulse that links all these sites is the same: the desire to shape the world so that memory, control, and meaning will outlast a single life. That desire is the engine of craft, ritual, administration, and spectacle, and it is the reason an odd artifact can matter as much as an entire ruin. We can be rigorous about the mechanisms of change, diffusion of techniques along trade corridors, independent invention in response to similar constraints, the rise and fall of elite systems that can marshal labor, and those explanations will often serve us well. Yet the archaeological record stubbornly insists on nuance. A mechanism etched into bronze could be the product of a lineage of makers lost to fire and conquest, or it might be a single brilliant mind who lived and died without apprentices. A monumental terrace could be the result of centralized coercion or a shared cosmology that made collective labor feel like worship. A submerged harbor might freeze technology in one tragic instant or preserve a corpus of applied knowledge we otherwise never see. The point is not to romanticize every find into a story of genius or catastrophe. The point is to keep our categories flexible enough to hold multiple causes at once. The past seldom hands us single explanations neatly wrapped. It tends to offer braided answers: social, environmental, spiritual, and accidental, and our job is to trace those braids without flattening them. There are intellectual dangers here that are worth stating plainly. First is the temptation to read myths as literal history or objects as proof of modern fantasies. Giants in a legend do not automatically translate into disproportionate skeletons. They may encode respect for elders, memory of nutritional regimes, or rhetorical exaggeration. Second is the ease with which anomalies invite grand narratives that leap past careful sequence. An advanced object appearing in a horizon where we expected simplicity should be a clarion call for more sampling, not for definitive revision. Third is the risk of privileging the spectacular over the mundane. A beautifully incised bronze plate demands our attention, but the survival of routine potsherds and hearths is what most often stitches ordinary lives into a readable fabric. Good archaeology resists the siren song of the exceptional and keeps a steady eye on the ordinary, because the ordinary is the background against which the exceptional gains meaning. And yet the exceptional matters, not because exceptions confirm our wonder, but because they force us to reconsider our assumptions about transmission, loss, and innovation. A singing globe, a subterranean observatory of lenses, a causeway that was more ritual than road, each suggests a question about how societies learn, teach, and encode knowledge. How much of technological skill is broadcastable across networks of exchange, and how much is embodied, transmitted hand-to-hand, face-to-face? When a craft disappears, is it because the materials failed, the social institutions collapsed, or the practice became taboo? When we ask these questions broadly, we start to see not a ladder of progress but a web in which different strands can be cut, knotted, or rewoven according to local need. That web refuses simple triumphalism about advancement, and instead urges us to appreciate contingency, the right confluence of people, place, and crisis that produces something memorable. There is another thread running through these mysteries that we must not neglect: ethics. Who gets to tell these stories? Who benefits from museum displays, academic prestige, or popular narratives spun around a spectacular find? Increasingly, the best scholarship is collaborative, working with descendant communities who often hold oral memories, songs, and custodial practices that can fill gaps our instruments cannot. Those voices remind us that artifacts are not isolated curiosities. They are the material residues of living cultural memory and contemporary claims. Respectful archaeology seeks permission, shares findings, and examines the politics of display and repatriation. This ethical posture does not diminish curiosity. It enriches it, by situating discovery inside relationships that have persisted, sometimes painfully, across centuries. But let us return to wonder for a moment, because it is the partner of ethics and the heartbeat of inquiry. Imagine, again, the metal plates etched with sail diagrams, not merely technical drawings but teaching tools, carried in chests from port to port, passing from hand to hand as apprentices learn the secrets of tar, rivet, and sail. Imagine the cave paintings that overlay one another like palimpsests, each repainting a negotiation between groups who deemed the site powerful enough to hold their marks. Imagine the terraces that require communal labor, and thus create not just food but ritual bonds. These images are not fantasy. They are plausible reconstructions that stitch together strands of evidence into human-scale scenes. They are empathetic reconstructions, offered with methodological caution and a hunger to be corrected by new data. So why do these mysteries matter to you and to us, beyond the intrinsic lure of a good story? First, they revise the sense of possibility for human ingenuity. They remind us that complexity can arise in surprising places and that the distribution of knowledge in the past was uneven in ways that still surprise us today. Second, they model a humility that is sorely needed in public discourse. We can be expert without being absolute. We can hold confidence and doubt together. Third, these puzzles invite public engagement with the past in productive ways. When viewers, students, and local communities take an active interest, archaeology becomes a shared endeavor rather than the exclusive domain of specialists. Public curiosity can be a force for preservation, funding, and better science, when it is coupled with responsible stewardship. Practically, what should we do with these mysteries? We continue to invest in careful excavation, in technologies that let us read minute traces without disturbing context, and in interdisciplinary teams that pair isotopic chemistry with social history and oral tradition. We must fund long-term projects that can trace patterns across time rather than insist on sensational single-season results. We must support conservation and community engagement, because objects left in the ground without respect can be lost to looting and neglect. And we must teach interpretive humility. The most responsible stories are ones that state their assumptions openly and invite correction. Emotionally, the payoff of engaging with these finds is simple and generous. They enlarge our sense of who we are. Each perplexing artifact, each uncanny terrace, each submerged quay is a small mirror held up to our species. They show us that people have always been capable of extraordinary ingenuity and ordinary kindness, that they feared what we fear and delighted where we delight, and that their world was as morally and materially complicated as ours. When you stand, hypothetically or literally, on a causeway where banners once whipped in a dawn wind, or crouch in a cave beneath layered pigments, you are cued into a human continuity that links your pulse to theirs. That continuity widens our moral imagination, how we treat their remains, how we build narratives about them, and how we apply the lessons of their ingenuity to our present challenges. And what of the unresolved questions? They are not disappointments, they are invitations. Each, we still don't know, is a door with the word open on it. It calls for more sampling, more debate, more interdisciplinary cross-pollination. Perhaps the next generation of archaeologists will find the workshop ledger that proves a theory. Perhaps an indigenous elder will recall a migration song that helps decode an enigmatic motif. Perhaps climate cores will clarify the timing of a collapse and reveal ecological rhythms that shaped human choices. The point is that knowledge is cumulative and communal. Mystery is not a final state, it is the engine of discovery. Finally, there is a practical hope embedded in these tales, that the same ingenuity that made complex terraces, precise instruments, and cosmological mosaics can inspire us now. When we face environmental stress, social fragmentation, and technological upheaval, the past offers not exact blueprints but lived experiments in adaptation, cooperation, and memory-making. The people who invested in infrastructure, who developed rituals to sustain cooperation, who encoded practical knowledge into object and song, they leave us a lineage of strategies to study and, where appropriate, emulate. Their failures and successes alike are data for the present. So walk away from these stories not with the smugness of having solved a puzzle, but with the humility of someone who has learned the value of patient attention. Remember the conservator's gloved hand, the diver's slow, breath-limited sweep, the elder's fragmentary tale, and the graduate student who notices a recurring motif no one else sees. These are the gestures that accumulate into understanding. Keep asking questions that matter. Who benefits from a particular narrative? What evidence would change our mind? How can we partner with living communities to tell fuller stories? Let curiosity be our compass and evidence our map, but allow room for the human imagination to bridge the gaps where science has yet to light the path. As we close this long conversation with the past, picture once more the fog-claimed plain, the singing sphere, the terraces with channels like careful breath, the submerged harbor with its etched plates, and the cave where pigments have layered like time. Here, beneath the catalogs of dates and the diagrams of craft, the sound of many hands shaping meaning out of matter. Those hands wanted memory. They built stones and wrote in wax to hold it. They wanted order. They engineered water and tuned instruments to enforce it. They wanted wonder. They painted, carved, and sang to keep it alive. Their artifacts arrive to us as both question and answer, partial, human, and eloquent. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.